Father, thanks for the opportunity just to be still, even for a moment. And we recognize that we are created beings and that you are a creator. God, that we have limits that you've pressed upon us that are good things. And so as we enter into your word this morning, Spirit, would you convict us where we need conviction? Would you comfort us where we need comfort? Would you help our hearts, minds, and actions align to the way of Jesus this morning? We need you to do it. We ask you to do it. We pray it in your name. Amen. So if your Bible's not already open it up to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to look at half of the chapter this morning. The second half we'll look at next week. We are in week 5 of a 12-week series as we're walking through this letter that the Apostle Paul writes to his young church leader named Timothy, where Timothy is in Ephesus. And we saw in the first chapter, just as a way of review, that Paul said, man, there's some false teaching, there's some false doctrine going on in your context, Timothy, and we need to figure that out. We need to fix that. That's not okay. He even names some of the false teachers at the end of chapter 1. But then, because Timothy has this problem, he doesn't jump straight to solutions. In chapter 2, the very beginning of the chapter we covered a couple weeks ago, he says, first, before you fix anything, first you need to pray. That Timothy's posture as a leader would be in prayer, that it would be in humility, that it would be in dependence. It wouldn't be, hey, I'm going to go and fix this problem on my own. And for us to realize that prayer is a primary posture to embrace, not a secondary button to be pushed. And so he says we need to pray. And then he keeps telling Timothy what the actual gospel is, because the way you see a counterfeit is because you know the real thing. And that's what Paul continues to do, is going like, hey, there's this counterfeit version out there. It's not right. It needs to get corrected. It needs to get realigned. And so because of that, we need to understand the real thing. And then he started talking about some of the pragmatics in their group. They're gathering together at the end of chapter 2. We talked about that last week. He said, man, if we're trying to hear the true story and we're not trying to be distracted by the counterfeit story, then we need to minimize the distractions that are going on in our gathered worship. Like men, you're walking in and you're disputing and you're fighting and you're baiting each other. Instead of doing that's a distraction. Instead of doing that, pray. Women, you're coming in and dressing in these fancy ways to say, kind of, look at me. And he's going like, stop doing that. Instead of that, put on good works. And as he says that, he goes, okay, now as we're trying to give some shape to this community that's kind of all over here, now as we begin to give you some instructions, I'm going to put some leaders around to kind of hem and understand what it looks like to continue to minimize those distractions so we can hear the true story of the gospel and who Jesus is. And so that's what he does in chapter 3. He gives some descriptions for specific leaders that we're going to unpack today in the text. Some of you guys know my wife and I both went to the University of Arizona years ago. She was a softball player there. I was in the women's basketball department. I was a manager for the women's basketball team, loved it. Then we came on staff with a group called Athletes in Action that did ministry to college and pro athletes. We ended up back at Arizona for 7 years at our alma mater, teaching there and discipling athletes and coaches. And when we were back there on our second stint, the weight room, it's now different, but the weight room at the time, you would walk into the weight room and big red letters, it read this. It said, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. You can put that next slide up there. It's this, that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And the reason that was up on the weight room is because probably every single athlete that was competing at this level, like their talent probably got them there. But then when you get into college, everybody's all state, everybody's all city, your talent only takes you so far. So when you come into this space and we get underneath the weight, like we need to learn what it means to work. Because if you rely on your talent, what you've maybe done your whole life, and you're not starting to work hard, you will get beat for the people that outwork you. And I always love that phrase. It's probably because I didn't have a lot of talent and I like to work hard, right? Like that's probably why it resonated with me. But often in the sports world, like talent gets too much reliance. And sometimes when we think about leadership in the world, I would say it could be talent, but it's really charisma. Almost gets looked at as too much, like we care way too much about charisma. And so if I could write a phrase, not on the wall, but in our hearts and in our minds when it comes to leadership, and what I think Timothy is hearing from Paul is this, that character beats charisma when charisma doesn't have character. That character beats charisma when charisma doesn't have character. And again, we have to understand what Paul is doing here. He's pressing up against the way of the world. Right? There's this way, this path, it's wide, it leads to destruction. Most people are on it, but there's this narrow road of Jesus that's a different way. And so when it comes to leadership, he's probably speaking into some of the things that are happening in the culture, and even some of the things that would be happening today, is this recipe. When we identify leaders and we would put leaders in place, typically the world, we're looking for a couple things. We're looking for power, we're looking for control, we're looking for charisma. Like, man, are they like a magnet to people? Are they really charismatic and they sound great and they look great? Man, do they have control? They can get things done. Do they have power to change certain things? And as we look at the world's version of leadership, like the kingdom, it's a different version. It's not power, it's not control, it's not charisma, it's service, it's responsibility, it's character. And so we're going to walk through today and next week, both sections of chapter 3. The big idea is this, and it'll be the same next week. We'll just look at it from a different angle, and it's this if you're taking notes. The world's leadership lens sees power, control, and charisma as essential. But the kingdom's leadership lens, sees service, responsibility, and character as essential. Now, let me just define character the way I'm using character so we're all on the same page. When I say character, I mean doing the right thing the right way for the right reason. Doing the right thing for the right way for the right reasons, and it will almost always cost you something. That's what I mean by character, and that's what Paul is going to put in front of, like, hey, these overseers, these elders, these bishops, like the people that you're going to put in charge to kind of him the flock, like they better have character. Otherwise, it's not going to go well for you. And again, oftentimes, that's maybe not the first thing we look for in a worldly leadership lens. It's probably there on the list somewhat, but probably we put other things on top of it, and Paul's going, you better not miss this one. One of the phrases we have in Redemption Church of 7 churches that are in a collective network together called Redemption, and we have 6 cultural statements that we go, man, we want to live by these things. And so if you walk out, you'll see all 6 of those on the wall above the Connect desk. And one of them is to learn how to do the Lord's work the Lord's way. Like, man, we could do the Lord's work in the context of helping people love God and love their neighbor and love their enemy, but you can do it in a really cutthroat way. You could do it in a way that's faster, that's bigger, that's more, look at me, and you just go like, that doesn't feel like the Lord's way. And so we don't only want to do the Lord's work, but we want to do it the Lord's way. And this is kind of what is driving Paul as he talks to Timothy, some of these characteristics to say, okay, this is the Lord's way. And it might look different than the way you're used to in the context of leadership. So let's jump in. We're going to walk through the 7 verses at the beginning of chapter 3, and then we'll look at the back end next week. So let's just, if you have a Bible, follow along with me. This is chapter 3, verse 1 of 1 Timothy. This is a trustworthy saying. If anybody aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. This office, sometimes it's translated bishop, sometimes it's translated elder in your Bible. It's stepping into an official role in this community. That's what Paul is saying. And he's saying, man, if you aspire to that, that's a noble task. The word aspire, actually in the Greek, we'll do a lot of Greek words because there's loaded meaning in some of these words that Paul uses today and throughout the book. But it's this idea of stretching. Like the idea of aspires to stretch. Like stretching is painful. You do it kind of over time. And he's saying like, man, if you aspire to that, that's a noble thing. But again, we have to stop for a minute and go like, how do most of us, if you grew up in the world's culture with leadership, how do we aspire for certain positions in leadership? Oftentimes we come into going like, okay, we got to climb this ladder. I'm going to get to the next rung because if I get to the next rung, I have more power, I have more control, maybe I have more money. And he's going, that's not how you aspire to this position. It's actually not climbing the ladder. It's actually coming down the ladder and serving. And so if you're familiar with the musical Hamilton, if you've seen the play or if you've seen it on Disney Plus, there's Alexander Hamilton and there's Aaron Burr, and they're fighting the whole history, right? Burr ends up killing Hamilton. If you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, that's just history, right? You should know that. But the whole time, they're jockeying for position, and Hamilton seems to keep besting Burr, and it's driving him he's so frustrated by it. And in the second act, Alexander Hamilton has a conversation with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams about where the banks are going to be and where the capital is going to be. And Aaron Burr does this whole number, it's amazing if you watch it, but he's always talking about, like, I'm not in the room where it happens. Room where it happens, right? Like, that's it. So Aaron Burr wants to be in that room because he's aspiring, not in the kingdom way, but in the way of, like, if I'm at the table, I'm a part of this decision, I have control, I have power, it's going to come back to me, but I'm not a part of this decision, so I'm just mad. And what Paul is going to tell Timothy is, like, man, it's a good thing to aspire to these things, but we have to do it in the kingdom way again. So as he continues, he begins with a list, verses 2 and 3. He says, therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. Let's kind of walk through these there's 7 things that he says this is what an overseer, an elder needs to have, and there's 4 that he goes, you don't need to have this. I recently went to the doctor for my yearly checkup. I just turned 46 a couple of months ago, and when I go to the doctor for my annual checkup, maybe like you, there's like 5 to 7 pages I have to fill out every single time on a clipboard, You go 5 minutes early, and it's like, do you have a history of heart disease? Do you have a history of cancer? Is there anything going on? Like, you have to, it's kind of annoying, and it's kind of like detailed, and you're just like, well, what are they looking for in that material? They're going like, is there anything that's happened or happening in your body or your history that's going to cause unhealth in you? Because we want to keep you healthy. And what Paul's doing to Timothy here, as he's going, okay, as you pick your leaders, you better have these things in play. And it's kind of monotonous, and it's kind of long, and you're kind of like, But if you don't do these things, these checklists, like, it's going to be bad. It's not going to be good. So let's walk through these together. And again, a list for all of us, whether we're elders or not, man, this is just a good list of characteristics that we should, as a follower of Jesus, be aspiring to these things all the time as we follow Jesus to become like him, to do what he does. So let's walk through these kind of rapid fire. The first one is he says to be above reproach. That's this idea of being blameless. Or the original language in the Greek, this is really interesting. It's unable to be arrested, which is kind of an interesting concept, right? This idea that, because I don't know if you can get arrested for not doing something. Like, you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You can be held suspicious. Even you can have the wrong friends, and you can get picked up and be arrested even if you didn't do anything. And Paul's going like, you need to be so far away from those things that you're above reproach. And when people look at you, there's kind of not a whiff of that type of activity. One of the coaches I worked with, who worked with the football players all the time, he would say this phrase all the time. And he would just go, man, if you don't want to slip, don't walk where it's wet. And it was like, because like these young athletes that were trying to walk with Jesus, but he's like, don't go in the club at 2 a.m. Like, do you know you're just setting yourself up for failure? And some of us, it could be that. Some of us, like, if we struggle with different things, like, man, we kind of want to flirt with it. We kind of want to get right up next to the line and then go, no, I'm not going to do that. And he's going, just don't even get near the line. Go the other direction. That's what he means by being above reproach. He continues to say, to be the husband of one wife. This literally translates in the Greek, a one-woman man. It's this idea that, man, you're faithful in your relationship to your wife. You don't have other relationships. You don't have an open marriage or polytheistic at the time in the culture. It's like, man, you are committed to one woman. He says you need to be sober-minded. That's this idea of being clear-headed. You're not letting anything influence your mind or your decision-making, that you would be clear-headed. Then he says you need to be self-controlled. You need to learn how to curb your impulse. Your flesh impulse, not walking in the flesh, which is all of our natural default, to operate on our own power, to do things that are counter to God, but you need to learn how to walk in the power of the Spirit, step by step, independence. God, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to do it? He's saying that needs to be a characteristic in being an overseer. He says that person needs to be respectable. That carries this idea of being orderly or having good behavior. He says they need to be hospitable. That carries with it this idea of being generous to guests. 1 Peter 4:9 says it this way. Peter says, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. And sometimes in leadership, I don't know if you've seen this, leadership, they'll be real hospitable to your face, like because they know they're supposed to, like, oh, come in. And that's, oh, I can't believe this is something. You know, like he's going like, don't do that. Don't grumble and complain. Understand what it means to be generous, to be inviting, to be loving, to be warm. And an overseer ought to be like that. And I think really some of the reason that people that display hospitality, some are just more naturally hospitable. My wife was way more naturally hospitable than me. If you know her, that's true. But as I learn how generous God has been with me in my own story, in my own life, it allows me to be generous with other people. And so there's something about that Paul, again, is drilling down in the characteristics of an overseer or an elder to go, they need to be hospitable. Next thing he says, they need to be able to teach. We talked about this last week. If you were with us last week, this is a different word. It has the same root, but it's a different word as 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. We looked at the 12 different times that word is used where Paul's saying, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority. It's not the same word here. This word is only used twice, and it means apt and skillful in teaching. That's what this word means. And so it's going like, okay, somebody that's an overseer, they need to be apt and skillful. Apt is like to the point. You need to be able to connect the dots, and you need to do it in a way that's kind of to the point in the midst of you shepherding people or loving people well. He says they need to be able to teach. They need to not be a drunkard. There's something going on with the false teaching in here, because we're going to see it again, both with false teaching and with greed, that it seems like that Paul is trying to point out to Timothy with what's going on in the culture, because, again, he'll talk about wine, but he's going, man, you can't be controlled by that. Don't let another substance control you. Don't let wine control you, specifically to control you to be violent. So the next part is not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle. This idea of not being violent is this, violent is like you're always ready to fight. Like that's your kind of default posture. Like, okay, oh, you want to, like, whether it's physical or it's emotional or it's mental, like let's mix it up right now. And Paul's going, don't do that. That's actually not helpful for an overseer. Instead, be gentle, be patient. And when we think about fighting, again, whether it's physical fighting, whether it's emotional fighting, what is fighting really about? It's like you're trying to get control. You're trying to get control of something or someone. And so Paul's saying, like, you don't need to be violent. You need to be gentle. You don't need to be quarrelsome is the next word he uses. That means peaceable. So again, your DNA is not to go, oh, you want to fight with me? Let's do it. As an overseer, it should be the opposite of that. And when I think about that, and this is a super old illustration, but any of you guys remember the old movie Karate Kid in the 80s? And Daniel LaRusso is the main character, and the person that trains him is Mr. Miyagi. And Mr. Miyagi can take everybody out. He has to do it a couple times in the movie. But he's constantly not trying to fight. He's constantly going like, no, let's not do this. Let's talk about this. Let's not. Like he's trying to avoid the fighting at all cost until he has to step up and fight. This is what I think Paul is telling Timothy in this characteristic of somebody that is an overseer. Paul says it differently in Romans chapter 12, verse 18. He goes, if at all possible, as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Those should be markers. And again, in the world's form of leadership, fighting is kind of like, that's actually a good thing. You're going to fight for the company. You're going to do the right thing. And he's going like, actually, you need to be gentle. We're called to be peacemakers is the way of Jesus. And then he says this last one. He says that an overseer should not be a lover of money. A lover of money. Again, there's something going on in the culture here, and he'll dive into it more in chapter 6 about this greed and this money that these false teachers are kind of beginning to replicate as they're teaching it correctly. And so it's this idea of not being greedy, right? Well, again, it's countercultural to our leadership lens of why we would choose leaders. Some will go like, no, it's actually good that they love money because then the company's going to get money. He goes, no, don't let him be a lover of money, right? John D. Rockefeller, who's, the first billionaire in our culture, tycoon in the turn of the century, like if you've heard the phrase, somebody's like, Rockefeller, like, how much more do you need? Why do you keep acquiring new companies? And it's like you've got stacks on stacks. It's Scrooge McDuck. You could dive into the money and swim around in it. The guy's going like, how much more do you need? Like, how much is enough? And Rockefeller goes, just a little more. Just a little more. I just need a little more. and that's greed. Again, it's specific to money here, but I think we can use it because I think some of the cultural context is with money, but I think greed in general is something we need to look out for in these overseers, these leaders, these elders. Because here's how it gets twisted in the church. You can go, well, we need more people at our church. Like, we need to be bigger. We need to plant more churches. Like, and then just go like, well, don't you want more people to hear Jesus? But it's really not about that. It's really about you have the biggest church in town. Like, that's greed. It's not helpful. It's not good. Paul's going, you need to look out for these types of things when you choose leaders. These are important things for us. And again, this list, these characteristics, so he says, man, it's a good thing if you aspire to that office. It is an office, and he's going, here's these characteristics. Here's these 12 things you need to pay attention when you're selecting these leaders to kind of hem in the congregation. And then he gives an example. And before we get to that, just like even as you think of these things, think of this list, it's not about perfection. It's about pattern over time, right? It's not about like, oh, well, Jim Ellis, I saw he was trying to get money out of my pocket, which Jim would never do, right? He's one of our elders. But it's not like you can never, like, it's pattern over time. This should be consistent of the character of an elder or an overseer, right? I hope that I make that clear. So as he says that, again, verse 2 and 3, an overseer must be above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Verse 4, he must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? Why does Paul use that as an example? He gives these characteristics, hey, pay attention to these things, and then, hey, here's a litmus test. And it's actually not just for elders overseas, it's actually for deacons as well. We'll get to that next week. It's the same kind of test of going like, why is that hard? Because if any of you know that have a family, it's just hard. Like, you can go to work and you've got separation from the people you work with. Most likely you leave that place. You've got some type of authority. Like, well, if I'm leading and you don't do what I say, you'll get fired. Like, there's at home, there's no separation. Your spouse knows exactly who you are. Your kids know exactly who you are. There's not a separation. And he specifically talks about children and helping them be submissive or obedient is another translation of this. It's not teenagers, it's little kids. And here's the reason I think he's using this analogy is because if you have kids, besides your spouse, they should be the most important thing to you. You love them more than anything else. And if you have kids, you know their hearts are dark and disobedient. Just naturally, because of sin, right? Like, it doesn't mean they're all bad, but the question is, like, how do you lovingly correct when your little kid does something that's not helpful for them? They're sticking their finger in the outlet, and you go, no, you can't do that. Like, I want to lovingly correct you because I know if you do that, that will be painful for you. And so if you can't figure out how to do that in your home with the people you love the most, and then you walk into this environment, and I love you guys. I don't love you like I love my kids or my wife. How am I going to have the ability to lovingly correct you if you need to be corrected? Like, that's what I think he's getting at. Like, again, he's going like, okay, you could do the eye test, and it can look all good, but if you step into somebody's home, and their spouse or their kids are going, oh, he's different. He's different here than he is there. That's a problem. That's why we're very slow and intentional here, specifically at Redemption Peoria, with putting people in an eldership position. It's a long process. Not because we're trying to make people perfect, but we go like, have we really turned over every stone to go, man, again, not perfection, pattern over time. So he uses that example. Because when you step into this position, like there are going to be times where you have to lovingly correct people. And your kid, like, you can have that conversation with your kid when they're little, and they can be so mad at you, and they go, I hate you, and storm off. And you go, I know they don't hate me. Like, you have the ability as a parent to go like, oh, that stung. But, like, you're mature enough to go like, okay, they're just mad. What happens when that happens in the church? Like, do you have the maturity to go like, okay, I get that stings. I get that hurts, but man, I'm doing this for their benefit, for their good. That's what I think we need to be aware of and be looking for when it's talking about overseers and elders. And then he gives a warning at the end, verses 6 and 7. He says this, he must not be a recent convert. So again, Paul gives this list of all these characteristics. He gives this litmus test, and then he's going, oh, here's this warning. In case they pass all these things, beware of this. They must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace or a snare of the devil. So here's the first warning, is like they shouldn't be a recent convert. And here's why I think Paul is saying this here, is because, man, think of what's going on in Ephesus right now. The story of Jesus is going out. And God is using his Spirit to waken people up to who he is and to radically save them. They were worshiping this other thing, or they didn't have any religious affinity, and all of a sudden this story of Jesus gets into their heart and changes them. And all of a sudden, if they're a CEO, if they're a leader in this company, you go, well, man, we need help with this. Like, this should just transfer over. So if they get saved and they're a leader, like, oh, let's use them in the church. And Paul's going, wait, don't do that. You need to hit pause first. That's a dangerous thing to do, because even if they have skills and abilities, the things that the world would say, yeah, they're a leader. You go, it doesn't always equate in the kingdom. And Paul himself, he goes, man, because they could get puffed up. They could get prideful. And that's the worst thing for a leader, is for that to happen. And so he's going, you just got to be careful. You got to slow play this thing. And Paul specifically, if you know his story, that's what happens to him. God radically meets him, changes his life in Acts chapter 9 on the road to Damascus. He's a leader in the Jewish church. He's killing Christians. He gets knocked off. He gets his name changed from Saul to Paul, and then he goes straight into ministry. No, he doesn't go straight into ministry. Galatians 3, he takes 3 years and goes and he learns the way of Jesus. He learns. And he patiently comes back. He's going like, listen, if somebody comes to Jesus in your culture, in your community, don't put him in a spot of leadership right away. Take your time. There's no rush on this thing. So that's one. And then the second warning, he just says, man, they have to be thought of well by outsiders. Again, it's kind of turning over every single rock to go like, okay, are there people that are frustrated with this person and we just don't see it? Because, man, we're all a mess. Right? I could look or sound good up here, but then you get me in a certain situation at a certain time, and I don't sound the same way. Like, I need to be congruent, right? My life has to be integrated in a good and healthy way to step into this position of leadership. So that's what Paul is saying, and then he kind of takes both of those warnings, and he uses the language of the devil, the adversary, like Genesis 4 says, like, sin is crouching at your door, and it wants to devour you. Paul's going like, listen, don't be quick in this thing, because you can say, wow, we need a leader, let's throw him in. And then you just go, oh, that's not bad, because they're going to get puffed up with conceit, and that's not going to be good. Or, man, if they're not thought of well by outsiders, they're going to fall into disgrace. Like the enemy wants to have you put somebody in a leadership position that they're not ready for. They would love that. That's what the enemy would do. And he's going, beware of that. So why is Paul making such a big deal out of this? Like, why is this such a big deal? He's going to take a whole chapter to unpack it, again, with elders and overseers here, and then with deacons that we're going to see next week. Like, why is he making such a big deal out of this character quality of a leader? It's because leaders really matter, and their character really matters. I once heard, which was a helpful illustration for me, because sometimes you go like, okay, well, like, I'm the pastor here. I'm one of the elders here. We have elders here that I think are qualified, and they love Jesus and they love you. And it's kind of like, okay, I'm the shepherd, and you're the sheep, right? Which I don't like that at all. I don't like that for a lot of reasons. I'm an under shepherd. Some of the language is better. Like, Jesus is the shepherd, not me. Right now, I have a responsibility to step into this role to shepherd you. As a verb to say, okay, how does it look like for me to come alongside you and point you back to Jesus? But I'm not the shepherd, Jesus is. Our elders aren't the shepherd, Jesus is the shepherd. So I heard one time somebody say it this way, which I just always stuck with me. I don't know who said it first, but it's really good. The responsibility of an overseer, even as Timothy is hearing this from Paul, it's not the responsibility of a shepherd, it's the responsibility of a sheepdog. Because what does a sheepdog do? Like it corrals the sheep. It protects the sheep back to the shepherd. So as an illustration, I want you to watch this 1-minute video of a sheepdog doing what a sheepdog ought to do. And pay attention. Pay attention to what happens here. Go ahead and play that. Come on. That's you guys. You guys are all the sheep.
Come by. Walk on. Good girl. Shh, shh, shh. Walk on. Lou. Up. Good girl, Stormy.
Okay, 2 things I love about that video. I mean, it's amazing. But number one, you see the sheepdog waits for the command from the shepherd and then goes and tries to get all the sheep back into where they need to belong. And then you see when it gets close, the dog just looks back at the shepherd because it's waiting for the command from the shepherd. It's not trying to do it on its own. It's not doing it for its own glory. It's going like, okay, what's the shepherd want me to do? Like, I understand the voice of the shepherd. I understand what my role is, and I'm going to do exactly what he wants me to do. I love that. And then I love when he looks back and gets the command and just runs back to the shepherd, right? And jumps up on the RV. Like there's something about understanding like that. That's our role as leaders here, is to walk alongside. We're one of the sheep, man. We're just an animal. We're pointing to the shepherd, not pointing to ourselves. And let me just say, if you're a member here at Redemption Peoria, you have good elders. Jim Ellis. Come on. The guy is just gold. Josh Kensley, Bruce Byler, like these men love Jesus and they love you. It's nothing to do with them at all. They want to go. What does it look like to corral us towards the shepherd? You have good elders at this church. We should be thankful for that. In the midst of it, why character matters so much in the economy of kingdom leadership, why this is a big deal. And if we don't take this list that Paul gives us seriously, then this is what happens. Let's play this next clip.
Nelson here. Nelson, come here. Here. Nelson, come here.
Okay. This dog is ill-equipped for the job. He looks cute, right? And again, if we use the world's leadership lens of like, oh, they're charismatic or they look good, or like, they're not going to be ready to do what they're called to do. And that's what Paul is saying. Like, can you imagine a wolf coming into this field with that dog, the second dog? And that's exactly what's happening in this story. There are wolves that want to pervert and change the gospel holistically. And Paul's going like, this is a problem. And so you better have the right people in the right seats to deal with this. And their character matters way more than their charisma. It's important for us to realize. It's a really, really big deal. And when we think about this, again, what we're trying to look at both in this whole chapter today and next week is that, again, the world's leadership lens sees power and control and charisma as essential. You can put that next slide up. But the kingdom leadership lens sees service, responsibility, and character as essential. Power and control and charisma are not bad things inherently. God has all those things. Jesus, when we think about the idea of, okay, like who is our shepherd? How does he lead? We just have to look to Jesus. Every time we look to Jesus. And Jesus has power. He has power to heal the blind. Jesus has control. He has control to say stop to the waves, and the storm stops. Jesus has charisma when he steps up and he gives the Sermon on the Mount. He has all of those things, but none of those things he does for himself. It's always look at my Father. Look at how you can be connected. Look how you can live in the way you were created to live. It's not about him. It's always about other people. And if we think about Jesus as we look at the leadership lens in the kingdom of his service, his responsibility, and his character, if anybody ought to be served, it's Jesus. And yet we see him in his darkest moment about to happen. He serves his disciples. He washes their feet, even the one that's going to betray him. Jesus shows us what service is like. If anybody shouldn't take responsibility for your sin and my sin, it's Jesus. And what does he do? He takes full responsibility for my sin, my shame, my imperfections on the cross. His perfect life, his death, and his resurrection. He takes the wrath of God poured out on him at the cross for you and for me. He takes full responsibility when it's not even his responsibility. He serves, he takes responsibility. And if character is doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, even if it costs you, Jesus always does the right thing. He always does it for the right reasons. And he always does it the right way. And it's cost him his life. And this is the shepherd we get to follow. Every single week we need to be reminded of that. That is who we follow. And yeah, we have sheepdogs along the way because we need each other in this thing. We do. But let's continue to remind ourselves where our leadership lens comes from. Not only this week, but we'll double down next week on what it means to be a deacon and what that looks like for all of us, not just in character, but in service. Let's pray together. Father, would you help us see this morning as we go throughout our life, God? Would you give us different lenses for leadership in the kingdom instead of the world? Would you help us look through those lenses so that we could see your life, your death, and your resurrection and give us a new perspective on the way we look and put people in leadership spaces? Would you help us do it? Spirit, we need you to do it. We ask that as we come to this time of response, God, you would be with us in our hearts and our minds and our hands. Make yourself more real to us today in a way that only you can do. We ask it in your name. Amen.